So far, so good. Nobody has been booted off. We're all still here. So I'm coming to you live from Panera Bread in Palm Springs, California. It's very exciting to be here in Palm Springs. And wanted to introduce Michael Swerdlow and okay, Basel Musharbash. Basil. Um, I should have practiced earlier today, but I was on the road. What can I tell you?
No, that was
Uh,
part. That was good.
anyway, we've been talking and planning about this event for what feels like 7 months. So I'm really glad that we were able to pull it off. And I know that everybody's going to be watching this on YouTube, so we're all going to have to be very prim and proper from now on. But I was really curious to hear from Michael. Is the and okay, now I'm going to screw this up. Anti-monopoly policy kit director, anti-monopoly. I'm going to let them introduce themselves because they're both much more well-spoken than I am. So, Michael, do you want to introduce yourself and then you can let us know how we're starting out?
Sure. Yeah, absolutely. My name is Michael. I'm the anti-monopoly director at the Democracy Policy Network. I used to work at the Department of Justice, the Antitrust Division, and I've also worked in the Federal Trade Commission doing antitrust work. And I'm super excited to be here today to talk to you. Basil, do you want to introduce yourself first, and then I can get
Sure.
into the question?
Sure. Hi, everybody. My name is Basel. I'm an antitrust and community development lawyer down in Paris. My firm is called Anti-Monopoly Council. We represent farmers, workers, small businesses, trade groups, and sometimes local governments. We primarily do regulatory advocacy on behalf of these groups, in connection with problems of concentrated economic power in different industries. We also do litigation and case development around in antitrust, consumer protection, and unfair trade practices for those same clients. Sometimes we also do policy counsel work with local governments to help develop anti-monopoly policies or community development policies that focus on growing from the inside out instead of just asking large corporations to subsidizing large corporations and giving them incentives. So glad to be here with you.
Great. So I think we're here today to talk about anti-monopoly and antitrust, which are two related ideas. One, anti-monopoly got started around the turn of the 20th century, a little before, and was a response to a new kind of business that they called it combinations of capital or substantial monopolies. And what that basically means is that through either contracts and agreements between multiple firms or within one firm, that group can control the economy and can change and hurt workers, consumers, farmers, small businesses, which are often all the same people, even if they have different, they always talk about, and antitrust people always talk about consumer, these are all the same people. And the primary tool of the anti-monopoly movement, the lasting legal legacy of that is the antitrust laws. And these antitrust laws were basically intended to restrain these combinations of capital, to stop them from coordinating the economy, and to allow subordinate groups to them, those workers, consumers, other people, to be free to combine and coordinate in ways that also restrain monopolies. That was the intention, widely understood, of the antitrust laws. Unfortunately, the courts and the development of antitrust law has more often been read to accommodate these combinations of capital and to determine that what they do naturally is efficient and good for the public and good for consumers, and to prevent subordinated groups from formally coordinating to restrain them, which is, I think, the great tragedy of the antitrust laws. Today's very different economy from the economy at the turn of the century, but I think, as Basil is going to talk about, we have some very similar tendencies of this new kind of business that we live under, the gig economy, tech, platforms, lots and lots of middlemen that is different in a fundamental way. They do harmful things left to their own devices. And we have these powerful tools, antitrust law, anti-monopoly movement organizing, that can restrain and restructure markets to work for those workers, consumers, small businesses that really, make up the economy. I think that's where I'm going to stop and hand it over to be able to talk about monopolies in the modern era.
Yeah, sure. So, I think so. Michael hinted at this, but basically we passed these antitrust laws in 1890 and 1914 and the early 20th century. And for a while, we didn't do anything with them. Then the New Deal came in the 1930s and 1940s, and they were really revitalized. And what they were revitalized to do was to really strike out at concentrated economic power across the economy in different industries. In the agriculture sector, you had a fertilizer trust, and you had a machinery trust, and you had railroads that discriminated against farmers and charged them exorbitant prices, and you had processing monopolies in the livestock sector. And all of these, what all of these monopolies did, certainly in agriculture, but they were common in other things in banking and other industries, is they sapped communities of wealth. They took wealth from workers, farmers, and consumers, either by charging higher prices or by reducing wages and compensation to their suppliers. And in the process, they didn't just harm individuals, they harmed all kinds of communities across the country. And so in the 1940s, as part of the New Deal, there was a big movement to disperse economic power to everybody across the country. Part of that was, breaking up a whole bunch of companies so that there's room for a wide variety of local, regional, and national companies in all the basic industries of the country. But another part of it was also enforcing the law against unfair trade practices and deceptive trade practices. We wanted to make sure that not only did companies not consolidate the market, that they didn't engage in practices that made it very difficult for small businesses to enter and compete. We wanted to make sure that they didn't do things that made it very hard for workers to organize and make sure that they're bargained for better wages and so forth. That altogether led to the economy that we had from the 1950s through the 1970s, which was really characterized by free, independent enterprise. There was lots of unionization. There was industries were very dynamic and innovative and open and small business oriented. Communities across the country, especially small towns and rural communities, actually grew and actually could develop their own business ecosystems because industries were not dominated by these large absentee corporations. You actually had, for example, by the 70s, rural communities and small towns were growing for the first time in like a century. But then in the 1980s, we forgot all of that. We decided we didn't want to enforce the antitrust laws. The courts reinterpreted a lot of them to make it harder to bring these kinds of cases, to make it harder to enforce them. And that led to the economy that we have today. I see a hand up from Catherine. Did you have a question?
Yeah, I was going to ask the question, when this shift happened, who was the president?
So it was Reagan in the 1980s. Although it should be noted, and this, this helps sometimes when we're talking to folks about anti-monopoly policy and why it gains bipartisan approval, is because the shift was really bipartisan. Carter, for example, was the first to stop enforcing the Robinson-Patman Act, which was an act designed to protect small retailers from getting higher prices from their suppliers than larger retailers. And these laws were critical to making sure that small retailers could compete and weren't being unfairly treated in the marketplace. And then you had Reagan, who obviously, he loosened merger control, allowing corporations across the economy to merge with each other. That's where the consolidated economy that we have today comes from. The fertilizer sector, I mentioned the fertilizer trust, reconsolidated in the 80s into just a few companies. Today we have basically 4 fertilizer companies. And he did a whole bunch of other things. But then he was also abetted by Bill Clinton after that. And Bill Clinton didn't change that, what Reagan put in place. So in some ways, what we're trying to do today is recover, a way of approaching the economy in a way of, thinking about economic power that both parties sort of abandoned in the 80s. But now the Democratic Party is starting to swing back into things, and also some Republicans. But I will say, in terms of the harms of that shift, we now, it used to be a debate, but now the evidence is in. The concentration in industry has led to higher prices, higher markups for consumers. It's led to lower prices for workers, lower wages for workers. It's depressed farmers' incomes, and it has also concentrated wealth and decision making in the hands of absentee corporations in large cities at the expense of smaller communities and rural places across the country. So whereas it used to be that, a small town could have multiple banks, multiple businesses, workers who had lots of options for who to work for and so forth. And from those people, a business ecosystem that could determine how the town develops. Now you have small towns, which is where I focus, dominated by out-of-town chain stores, out-of-town industries, over which they have very little control and that have very little investment in the community. That is fundamentally what the anti-monopoly movement that's now burgeoning is about reversing. We're trying to reverse that shift that happened in the 80s, and in the process, build an economy that's free and fair, and where everybody can have the power to decide their own future, and every community can do the same. So with that, I'll turn it back to Michael to talk about some policies in that vein.
Sure, yeah. So I put in the chat a PDF with some of these policy ideas, and we're going to start on page 2 and then go back up to page 1. But I think one of the
it only shows for people who were present at the time. I could probably re-upload it, but
I can
if
do
it's
that,
handy for you to add it in.
Yeah. I just sent it again right there.
Right.
You can look at it after. But I think one of the great successes of the Biden administration has been its antitrust and anti-monopoly program. It's really pushed back on a way of thinking that we were just talking about, that assumed that what business was doing was probably efficient and we should stay out of it, and has scrutinized not only big tech, which is kind of like the headline story, all these investigations and lawsuits against companies like Google and Facebook, but also passed laws and regulations and use sort of the regulatory power to go after harmful, anti-competitive practices of businesses. So like the headline one I think will be the most significant is sort of non-compete agreements, and just banning them from the FTC doing that. Others sort of include, I don't know if anyone's heard this term, junk fees. but basically the idea that big company, everyone knows what this is. Everyone knows, like, you go, you want cable, you want internet, and you go and you're like, oh, I would like a price for what this is. And they're like, oh, good news, the promotional price is $20. You're like, oh, that's great. You sign up, and then you see the bill, and it's like, oh, no, that's the 5-month price, and now it's $80. You're like, what? This is fake. Okay, anyway, so like these like very blatant abuses, the Biden administration has done a great job at sort of identifying, targeting, and mainlining. And states can sort of finish the job and sort of cement that after he's gone by passing complementary laws. And California has been a real leader at this so far, but there's nothing more they can do. So California has passed a ban on non-compete agreements last year, but an effort to expand that to supposedly quote unquote independent contractor workers, basically the gig economy, and also to create real penalties for it, failed and went down because sort of organized business groups defeated it. So that's something that might be brought back over the next year. There was a bill banning junk fees, these things I was talking about. That's great. And there's been renewed emphasis on sort of this idea of a labor conspiracy in antitrust, or basically that firms get together and they decide, they fix wages. They say, we're only going to pay our workers this much. They agree not to hire each other's workers, do things like that. The Biden administration has been more vocal about trying to crack down on that, and states could follow. And then also, middlemen. So like Ticketmaster, if anyone's heard, but that's sort of the area that the Biden administration has been scrutinizing. Beyond that, there is a push and an effort in California to think about. Oh yeah, go ahead.
Interject here just to sort of like put that in more crisp terms. The like a good example of this is in the agriculture sector. The Department of Justice filed a lawsuit last year, alleging that the producers of 90% of the chicken in the country, 90% of the pork in the country, 90% of turkeys were colluding with each other to set the wages that they pay to workers, and also on the flip side, set consumer prices. And in the process, that resulted in massively depressed wages for workers in that sector compared to other manufacturing sectors, causing sundry losses to communities everywhere. So this is real life stuff that's happening all across the economy. Same thing you can find in, for example, in banking. We had massive bank mergers for a very long time, and a whole bunch of anti-competitive practices that made it harder for new banks to enter into the market. So that now basically, 60% of savings are in the hands of like 5 banks, and 100 banks altogether control 90% or so of deposits. And the result of that, the CFPB, the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau, published a study just a few days ago showing that the result of that is that large banks have much less competition, and they feel just fine charging way higher fees on credit cards, way lower interest rates on deposits, et cetera. So these are the things that the Biden administration has been sort of uncovering and shifting focus towards in a really significant and helpful way. Back to you, Michael. Sorry about that.
No, that was great. That was great. That was great context. So outside of those, where we're talking about sort of like specific industry focused practice efforts, one thing that's not on the table because of how Congress works is like just new antitrust laws to clarify or reinterpret the law as written. But at the state level, that's something that is way more on the table. So right now, California has this thing called the California Law Review Commission, which is studying whether to adopt new antitrust laws, specifically whether to adopt something called an abuse of dominance law, which would make it so that it's prohibited for monopolies to use their power and abuse it, basically. Right now, at the federal level, it's only prohibited for monopolies to use their power in ways that gets them more power. is like sort of the simplified way of doing it, which is, sort of a distinct, it's we don't need to get into what it is, but basically there's an effort at the state level to try and replace that regime with a regime that says, you don't have to prove that you're getting more power from this. We just have to identify that what you're doing is abusive and unfair, and then the government can restructure it and help fix in that area. In California, in particular, there is no anti-monopoly law. There is no single firm capacity to go after a single firm for doing even what would be prohibited at the federal level. That's been sort of interpreted out of California law. But that's also part of the effort to look at, to try and find, even if we don't get an abusive dominance law, we could get the equivalent of the federal standard. And there's also talks about trying to include a labor-focused antitrust law, like a labor abusive dominance kind of law, just to clarify that this counts for workers too. And the last bucket of laws I'll quickly talk about is sort of this idea, which I think would be very relevant to this group, of countervailing power, or this idea that the law can, especially local law and state law, can empower groups that are getting hurt by monopolies to constrain those monopolies. And so instead of having these general antitrust laws that try and determine, are you abusing your power? Are you doing this? Are you doing a bad thing? It's saying, no, this relationship is bad. And we need to give this subordinated group the power to like level the playing field. So California, the most clear example of this is this thing called the Fast Food Bargaining Council that they just created, which the fast food industry, as many of you know, is heavily sort of fragmented in that there's a lot of these stores are franchises. Like all the McDonald's aren't actually one McDonald's corporation. These are independent franchises, which makes it very hard for the workers and for the people that actually run them to get a fair deal. So basically this council now is in place, and there are workers on the council, and there are management on the council, and they can set working standards collectively. And they just raised the minimum wage for the industry to $20 an hour, which is going to take over soon, which is a huge improvement over what it was before. And you can imagine these sorts of kinds of countervailing power at the local level for all sorts of things. So like you probably have, I think California has Time Warner Cable, right, or Spectrum as your sole internet provider for most people. You could have a municipal council that bargains with them and says, hey, you can't, this is enough is enough. Can't charge us so much for such poor and unreliable internet, and really have consumer power to bargain that down. So that's sort of the idea of like countervailing power, and can be applied all sorts of things in the economy. So I'm going to pass it over, but in summary, you can the three efforts I think you can focus on are reinforcing the Biden agenda at the state level, passing stronger antitrust laws that allow the government to come down on abuses of power and monopoly activity, and creating systems of countervailing power that allow workers, consumers, farmers to restrain monopolies without this like litigious process that takes years and years and years. Anyway.
No, that's excellent. I think, and I want to give a good example of that, especially on that countervailing power part. So, I think lots of you guys maybe, are familiar with like the fact that local news has disappeared across the country, right? Local newspapers have shut down in droves, especially in the last decade. And we often sort of hear that attributed to, it's just the internet came up, people stopped advertising in newspapers, and so they just couldn't sustain themselves and they fell away. So not exactly. Two things actually happened. One is social media companies and search companies like Google used the content of newspapers and journalism organizations of all kinds to basically build their platforms. Right? Google isn't anything if you can't reach the things that you want on it when you search for them. And it's a valuable thing that they can link to these newspapers, and that they can also like crawl them and all of that. But they were able to, basically appropriate all of that without paying the newspapers anything. And also they were able to take a whole bunch of advertising revenue from those newspapers without paying them much for it, particularly because by the mid 2010s, Google, Facebook, etc., were effectively monopolies. The newspapers could only get to readers online through those gatekeepers. And so they can't bargain, especially if you're bargaining individually. So there's a law in Congress, and states can do different aspects of it, to sort of allow newspapers to bargain collectively with these platforms in order to make sure that there's a fair give and take in these markets. And the other thing that happened to local news is being rolled up by private equity groups and absentee owners that essentially decided that a local newspaper should be a cash cow instead of a source of news for the community. So they cut down all the news functions and basically made a newspaper into a glorified newspaper rag, often cut out paper circulation entirely, and more generally relied on national news syndicates for their articles. So instead of having local journalists on the beat covering local things, you just have an outlet that's printing stories from the national syndicated groups. So that in some, those are the things that local and state governments can play a really important role in counteracting. And I'm going to focus on the local piece to complement what Mike said about the state piece. At the local level, I think a lot of times we tend to think that local governments tend not to think about the markets that they are a part of, that the people in their community participate in. And we need to, the new sort of, what I think we're realizing with the anti-monopoly movement is that a shift is needed. A local government, typically your council, your city manager, is not thinking of, is not necessarily digging into what is the reason, what is the reason that local businesses are really, what types of industries do we have, and how are those industries structured so that the local businesses in them are being hurt somehow. They're not necessarily thinking, for example, about how local developers why exactly are local developers struggling as compared to larger regional and national development groups, or why is it that, for example, that wages are depressed in say our small town compared to the larger cities, and how is competition part of it? The sort of an anti-monopoly sort of perspective on local policy would dig into those things instead of just sort of instead of thinking about economic development as a thing that revolves around subsidies, we should start thinking about economic development as a thing that revolves around cultivation. Right now, for the most part, your economic development office is focusing on attracting a new plant or a business establishment from a large national corporation of some kind. And they focus, the way they do that is basically they think about different subsidies, tax abatements, cash subsidies, building infrastructure that is geared towards serving just one plant or one business. The problem with that is that it just entrenches those large corporations and gives them a leg up over any possible competition, right? So Amazon, for example, attracts huge subsidies for its data centers that make it so that it's much harder for anybody else to build data centers. Same thing for, when you have, in terms of just like development itself, if you have a large developer that's coming in to put in a big, storage depot or a big home building, home development, they're going to get a much more sympathetic ear from economic development folks, and that's going to come at the expense of local folks. And if we shift from that, what local governments can do is focus on rebuilding their local business ecosystems. You used to have, in local communities across the country, every community had sources of capital, local banks, people who have money saved up, and they would, those would be paired with an entrepreneurial class, folks who started businesses, who had ideas, and folks who were just already engaged in business and saw opportunities and sought to capitalize them. They also worked with, had, of course, a pool of workers of different kinds, and different consumers of their products in that same ecosystem. You can start rebuilding that web. One of the way, there are many ways, and we can talk a lot about this, but I'm being told that we are taking a little bit too long. So we're going to move to questions in a minute, but I will say, you can build community wealth funds to mobilize local savings and pair them with local banks so that they support your local developer who's trying to rehab old buildings, downtown in your historic downtown, instead of the large developer who's building sprawl out on the edge of the community. You can look at regulations that are impeding the ability of small businesses to grow internally in food, retail, service, etc. And finally, one thing that all local governments can do is start finding out how consolidation is harming local businesses and harming the local government directly. For example, in procurement. I have a case right now dealing with consolidation in the GovTech sector, which a city manager that I talked to just had no concept of the idea that the fact that he had 2 suppliers only after he used to have like 10 just 10 years ago, that is something that he could tackle through antitrust law by being a plaintiff. So I think just starting to think about how markets are structured, how we can change them, and how we can support the small businesses in them, those would be the starting points for an anti-monopoly local policy. And with that, I'll turn it over to David.
Thank you. Yeah, this is amazing. And I think early on you said Paris. We should probably clarify Paris, Texas, just so that. But no, it's been a wealth of information, and I know I have a ton of questions, but I want to make sure everybody else gets a chance too. My first one, Michael, you brought up a couple times, and maybe I'm confused about what falls under the FTC's jurisdiction, what falls under the Department of Justice's jurisdiction, and it seems like there's other parts that fall under other things. But maybe just, is there a helpful way to think about which falls into which bucket?
This is a very good question. There is no logical rhyme or reason to what is covered by which agency between the two of them. There is a process that they go through. And so it's like, we know that certain things are DOJ and certain things are FTC, and there's an interagency process that decides that. Besides that, there are many more rational other parts of the government, like the Department of Agriculture has its own antitrust authority, and it has an area there. The Federal Reserve has its own antitrust authority for the banks. And so the FCC for communications has some anti-monopoly antitrust authority. So there are sort of like specific agencies in the government that have them, but for the main two, we do not have. It's not really. It's like a shared jurisdiction, and they have a process for doling that out. I mean, Basil, maybe you may have a footnote on that.
Well, I think I can give a little bit of, positive guidance on what, if you have a problem, who do you go to? If you have a problem in the livestock sector, if you're dealing with farmers of livestock, if you're dealing with people who sell beef or meats, go to the USDA. The USDA has the authority to monitor unfair trade practices, monopolization, deceptive practices, consumer fraud type things in that sector. The FTC is basically the place to go for anywhere else dealing with unfair trade practices that make it very difficult for small businesses to grow, practices that harm consumers, deceive consumers, and practices that are just unfair, that cause lots of harm for the benefit of a business and don't have any countervailing, benefit. It's just unfair conduct. So that's where you go for that. DOJ, although yes, they share authority with the FTC on this stuff, but if you have a problem with monopolization, you can always go to the DOJ. They talk to them about it, or go to both. And finally, as Mike said, you have special authority in FCC in the communications sector, internet, cable, telephone, etc. And you have some special authority in the CFPB and the banking agencies to deal with monopoly in the banking sector. But even that is also subject to monitoring by the FTC and the DOJ. So in sum, go to the FTC with your unfair trade practices, go to DOJ with your monopolization claims. And yeah.
Yeah. And I'd also just a quick addendum to that. I'd add, like, also think about going local and state in potentially like orthogonal ways. If you like, so like for one instance is like food deserts, for instance, like your local government could start their own grocery store. For broadband, you could try and get the FCC to come down and try and get involved, or the local government start their own public option and fund their own Wi-Fi. And these are like expensive things, and it's tough. But when you're thinking about organizing campaigns, I would also think about, even if my local government doesn't have these muscles to do it, could they do it? And is it worth being loud and being annoying enough that they might consider, stepping outside the boundaries?
Another place I will mention, like to dovetail with that, is going to your state attorney general and your county attorneys to the extent that they have authority to enforce consumer protection, state antitrust laws, state unfair trade practice laws. That can be an enormous tool for organizing, right? If you can find out what is harming your local businesses in a particular industry, or something that's happening in the labor markets, you can go to your state AG and tell them about it, and they can bring a case, and that can be very politically potent. We saw that recently in real estate markets, right? You have situations where landlords are consolidating apartments in specific markets, raising prices, using software to share rent information and collude to raise rent. And those have been the subject of federal lawsuits, but also an enterprising state AG, I always like to say, is much better suited to investigate what's going on in the local real estate market. And they can bring a lawsuit and put literal, reimbursement checks in the pockets of local consumers that have been ripped off by these unfair and monopolistic practices. I think you can make that case to a politician, and in the process show people that they can make a difference, and hopefully that helps organizing. So yeah, activate your state AG.
Never would have thought I could do that. But Don or Catherine, did you have a question? Saw your hand up before.
I was just, noticing that both Basil and Michael were talking about the Biden administration working on this. And I'm thinking, hey, if I were trying to decide between Trump and Biden, I would think that those gentlemen just convinced me Biden is probably better for a a better government or a better world because of these monopoly busting ideas and work.
I certainly agree. Gary, you have a question?
Well, only if we are like, if it's time for that. I didn't want
Absolutely.
to interrupt the flow. Okay. And also, I'm just wondering, is it possible to pause the recording while I ask my question? Since this is going up on YouTube?
Thinking about, I'm glad you're thinking about these things, and I'm glad that it sort of rang a bell. I think I will say something that we've noticed is that one, in terms of local development, when you dig into the market and the tax, the real estate market and the taxes that it generates, those older neighborhoods with a more traditional development pattern, without wide roads, that are less speedy, less car dependent, they generate more taxes per acre, and they cost a lot less in infrastructure costs. And so what investment in them is actually tax positive. Whereas, a big sort of sprawl development, or a big development around, say, a massive entertainment venue or chain store or what have you, which is really mostly parking lot and roads, that ends up not generating taxes sufficient to cover the infrastructure costs that are incurred. And the way that intersects with anti-monopoly is that, the folks who are trying to redevelop those older neighborhoods, they're smaller local developers, because you need to understand the local market in order to engage in those older neighborhoods. You can't just be a helicopter investor. You need those local connections to make it succeed, which only local folks have. And, typically, of course, we find that, supporting those smaller upstart folks in the development market and in the various business markets in the community often aligns with equity, race and class equity, because racial minorities are often excluded from the dominant groups in industries. So it can also be a racial equity strategy, or there can be a lens to that. The USDA recently used its anti-monopoly authorities to make sure that livestock processors aren't discriminating against historically marginalized folks, and that same alignment can exist at the local level too.
Yeah.
Thanks for the comment.
Michael, go ahead.
I'd also say extremely briefly, I would look into what kind of subsidies those companies are getting, and I'd also look into the process for amending your city charter. So in California, amending the city charter goes to the state legislature and gets approved, and that's very important because usually those aren't very contentious, but it allows the city to do a wide variety of things because the state then blesses that inherently, and so that adds an added layer of protection. So I'd look into those things and even see when those tax credits, those tax breaks, what are the renegotiation points? Can that be sort of like a leverage point to say, if you want this tax break still, we need you to do X, and then try and make that a campaign. I think that's potentially something, but I don't know.
The Strong Towns Group. Sorry, Carrie. Yeah.
I was going to say that, yeah, along those same lines, it feels overwhelming, a lot of what you're talking about. And, Michael, I think you and I were talking about this a little bit before the recording started, was just that, everything feels so complex and so burdensome, and it feels like you need a good number of people bought into this concept to be able to do a lot of the different things that we're talking about, to have a lot of community support, change the city charter, to file, a joint lawsuit or to get the state AG's attention or et cetera, et cetera. And I just popped in the chat, the Democracy Policy Network kit on, a lot of the work that you're doing there, Michael, is trying to take successes that are happening state by state and create a structure where people can learn from each other. And I just, one, want to promote that, and two, also, how do you, any thoughts or suggestions on how we find either the right number of people or the right types of people to enact a lot of these things, and to take some people like myself who are novices at this but have good intentions for my community? How do we help gain the confidence, the strength, or the allies to, because it seems like what I'm hearing from both of you is a lot of this stuff is not new. It was done well in the 1930s. And then we sort of, uh, either allowed or accidentally or whatever, allowed it to backtrack the other way, or maybe the complexity grew, or the people who were blocking it got much more sophisticated in the tools that they were creating to create, I think, a wall of smoke or something that one of the two of you had said earlier. So thoughts on how we could help citizen activists like ourselves move into this instead of without getting a law degree?
I think that's a brilliant question, and I actually tend to think that the beauty of this anti-monopoly stuff is that it doesn't take too much to get started, and to start, finding ways to make a difference. If you really only you can start with the people and businesses, right? If you have a few restaurants that you really like, talk to them about what problems are they facing. If they they're probably going to start telling you that, oh, our prices are going up from our supplier and they don't give us good service. They give lower prices to the bigger chains that we can't get, or we can't get supplies because they're dedicating them to other people. Okay, that's that's a start. And now suddenly you have a sense of what are some unfair things that are going on. You can talk to, you can start thinking about how do we fix that. My law, you can talk to folks like me, who help specialize in sort of helping find legal pathways to remedy these things, or talk to there's the Democracy Policy Network, folks like Michael, to think about policy. And then you can, if you have a sense of something that is really unfair, you could bring it to your state AG and tell them, can you, or not your state AG, maybe your local county attorney, and tell them this is a problem that needs to be fixed. And a small thing on small, by small step by small step, you start making a difference. But in a lot of ways, it just takes starting with the businesses and the people that and you don't have to think about this big giant picture and restructuring the entire economy. You can just start at home.
Yeah, I recommend two strategies. One, pick something simple that is intuitively makes people angry, and just is like viscerally like you're getting ripped off. And there are lots of areas of the economy where you just know you're getting ripped off. And I think that just makes it a lot easier, and be discreet about it. So, if you're going to have a campaign, find something that just feels wrong. It's wrong. That if you went to your aunt or your uncle or your brother or your cousin, you're like, hey, this thing, their first resident, of course I know this thing. Of course. And just keep it on that level. Just keep it there, and just try and make the solutions just as clear as possible, that one, we can do something about it. This is not, from down on high. Like, this is something our government can do. This is something we can do, and just start from there. And then the other thing I'd recommend is find very highly technical venues that don't get a lot of human participation from people that don't get paid to lobby them, like the California Law Review Commission is, I think, one that is screaming out for people to reach out to. In the one pager there, I listed all the anti-monopoly bills in California, the legislature that are coming up. If you guys could get a couple dozen people to call, to write, to say, I'm mad about this, you guys need to deal with that, you will be some of the only couple dozen real human beings that are not paid lobbyists to be engaging with legislators, be engaging with these law review commission people, to let them know that this is not just an academic debate between lawyers and economists, that there are real people involved. So I think, yeah, just to find something that is just wrong and then engage in a highly specific technical venue that we are happy to point you towards, whether that is the state AG's office, whether that is the Law Review Commission, whether that is the legislature, or the city council.
Fabulous. Thank you. Don or Catherine?
Yeah, it's me again. How much is internet and TV worth from Spectrum? I mean, we're paying near $200 a month for internet and TV, and it's not like we've got the top of the line TV service, it's just sort of a little bit better than basic, but geez, $200 a month. When you talk about, you feel like you're getting ripped off, I feel like I'm getting ripped off.
Let's find out who regulates Spectrum at the state level, and let's go talk to them. You can say the exact thing you just said, and you'd be one of the only 12 people who testify at whatever hearing they hold.
I think we can get a lot more people about cable companies.
That's right. That's right.
Yeah. Well,
Perfect.
we're approaching the top of the hour. Any last thoughts from both of you that you'd like?
Michael, do you want to hit us off? I'll just say it's been a pleasure talking to this group tonight. I'm gonna re-up the handout that I put in the chat, which goes over a lot of the things in there. I'd be excited to work with any of you guys if you decided that you wanted to try and reach out to the Law Review Commission, if you decided that you wanted to reach out to on any of the bills that are listed there, or if you have a bill idea or something like that that you want to do. I'm super happy to read over or be in conversation or talk with you in whatever way that could be useful. And yeah, I just hope that we made this stuff a little more concrete than it might have been before.
Absolutely.
Yeah. And I just want to say that I think what you guys are doing in terms of developing a well-being economy and reorienting our thinking around, does this actually make our life better, is really important to a lot of the anti-monopoly work and is really aligned with it. And if you have any questions, if there's any way that I could be helpful or anybody else could be helpful, just reach out to anyone who's working on this stuff and you'll find that we'd be happy to jump right in or know someone who can jump right in to help you. So feel free to reach out.
Yeah, this was great. I will send out the video to all the people on the list and attach the PDF. And also I'm thinking of a lot of groups of specific people who really should be watching what we went over today to open their eyes to a lot of avenues that they're not even thinking about in the work that they're doing. So this was great, and I probably need to watch again to take notes and sort it all out. And thank you for the PDF, and thank you both for all your time, and thanks for everyone who was here. I'm going to stop the recording.